And welcome back to Hannity. President Obama's arrogance was on full display yesterday when he nominated former Senator Chuck Hagel to be the next defense secretary. Now, while there are numerous reasons why this would be a disastrous move for the country, one thing is for certain. Hagel is not a fan of our closest ally. Now, after hearing about our commander-in-chief's controversial pick yesterday, the Emergency Committee for Israel, they released this ad. Watch this.
Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel? President Obama says he supports sanctions on Iran. Hagel voted against them. Hagel voted against labeling Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group. And while President Obama says all options are on the table for preventing a nuclear Iran, Hagel says military action is not a viable, feasible, responsible option. President Obama, for Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel is not a responsible option.
Joining me now, a rising star in the Republican Party who has already come out and voiced his opposition to Hagel's nomination, Texas Senator in studio, Ted Cruz. How are you, sir?
Sean,
congrats on your big victory.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. What about his inability to name terrorist groups for what they are?
It's really remarkable. You know, that ad, I think, highlighted a number of the aspects of Senator Hagel's record that are most troubling. You take, for example, a vote on designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group. Now, at the time, the Revolutionary Guard was sending explosively formed projectiles into Iraq, and they were being used to kill our service members. That's the definition of terrorism. And it makes one wonder, if they are not terrorists, who is?
Well, it's not only them. It's Hezbollah, Yasser Arafat, the Fatah at the time, Hamas. What about these issues with Israel? He actually even talked about a starting point. He accepted the Saudi peace initiative, which would have forced Israel to return the Golan Heights, the West Bank, much of Jerusalem, which would mean they'd have indefensible borders. And then his statement about the Jewish lobby intimidates a lot of people up there.
You look at Chuck Hagel's record, and it places him on the outer fringe in terms of his views of national security. In fact, the Washington Post describes him as at, quote, near the fringe of the Senate. Now, this is a man who served honorably for his nation. He was wounded defending his nation. I respect him personally, but his views are not in the mainstream, and I don't think they'd serve this nation well leading the Department of Defense.
Well, then we have the announcement of Brennan for CIA, and Brennan is a guy that said jihad is a legitimate tenet of Islam. Jihad, holy war, we all interpret it to be what it is, terrorism against Westerners?
You know, there's a pattern here, Sean, which is I think the president has drunk the Kool-Aid. He was reelected, and at this point, he thinks he can do nothing wrong. He went through the fiscal cliff. He got exactly what he wanted in the fiscal cliff. And you take the Hagel nomination, for example. They floated this trial balloon for several weeks, and you saw a number of Republicans come out against it. You saw crickets chirping among Democrat senators. Typically, one floats a trial balloon to get a sense of support. It was clear there was strong bipartisan opposition to Chuck Hagel, and President Obama decided he didn't care. He was going to force it through and pick this fight because I think politically he thinks he can pick any fight he wants.
It is interesting now because see, the president definitely is showing that arrogance. I totally agree with you. All right, you said something the other day I was really glad you said. I think the Republicans were weak when it came to the fiscal cliff. I think they have a lot more leverage now over the debt ceiling.
Yep.
So my question to you, you said they should be willing to shut the government down, not all functions of the government.
Right.
What would you shut down, and do you think your fellow Republicans will do that?
Well, I hope we stand strong. I mean, the reason we got a lousy deal with the fiscal cliff is that President Obama had the leverage. Because when you got divided government, whoever owns the default, whoever wins if nothing is done, is in the strongest position. And Obama was in a strong position there because if nothing was done, taxes were raised on every American taxpayer. With respect to the debt ceiling, we have the default. If fiscal conservatives stand together, we can force some substantive reforms, some pro-growth reforms, and if not, the effect is not a default. And Obama's going to say that over and over and over again. And we've got to be very clear, it's not a default. We should always, always, always pay our debts. But what the effect would be is a partial government shutdown. And we've seen that before. We saw it in 1995 with Republicans in Congress.
And it worked. We got to a balanced budget for the first time.
Year after year after year.
All right, let me ask you, there seems to be this trial balloon. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next segment. And if you look at Article 1, Constitution says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress, et cetera. And then it goes on, Section 7 is very clear, spending is in the House of Representatives.
Yep.
Seems they're floating this trial balloon that they want to use the 14th Amendment, Section 4, as the debt. Why constitutionally, and you're an authority, is that it's never been tried before. We've never had debt like this before either. But if he tries to circumvent the House of Representatives' constitutional authority, what will that mean?
It is part and parcel, unfortunately, with a pattern this president has demonstrated from the first term of repeatedly disregarding that document. I have to say, as a constitutional litigator, it warms my heart to see you pull out a copy of the Constitution.
Right there, from the Heritage Foundation. I carry it with me everywhere. So,
you know, we saw in the first term the president repeatedly ignore the constraints of the Constitution, ignore the constraints of federal law to implement his agenda. And I think in the second term, that's only going to get worse.
Because he's arrogant. After the fiscal cliff, after the re-election, he doesn't have to worry about election again.
And, you know, and I'll tell you what, liberals should be concerned about this. If you're on the left, you shouldn't like an imperial president, a Nixonian president that disregards Congress. Congress is a democratic check on the president, and yet it seems the left is absolutely silent.
Well, you're a breath of fresh air in the Senate. We certainly are happy you're there. And as a conservative, thank you for being with us, and hope you'll come on the program often. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Sean. Thanks for having me.